involve your workforce early on in the process to make them feel a part of it. And also, it's not just like a change management trick to make them feel a part of it. We also need to respect the fact that our frontline employees that are engaging with customers on a day-to-day basis often have a far better understanding of what the needs actually are than managers that sit layers and layers and layers above. So it's not just sort of an exercise to placate them and to make them feel part of the journey. They really can contribute significantly to helping you achieve the best outcome, but involve them early and all the way through. Hello, welcome to the Unscripted podcast, where you'll find discussions on what matters most in service, leadership, and business transformation. I'm your host, Sarah Nicastro. Let's jump in.
First, thank you, Sarah, for your participation with me today. My pleasure to have you in my strategic management course with my participant. My pleasure.
Happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
I like it a lot, term customer engagement. So what does it mean, customer engagement in real? Related to a lot of buzzword, how we can consider customer feedback, customer satisfaction, customer experience, and customer centricity. What does it mean, customer engagement?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the way I like to think of it is customer experience is probably the most common focus for people. So when they're considering themselves as customer-centric, they think about the customer experience. And then when you think about the customer experience, oftentimes different terms come into play of the customer journey, customer feedback, customer sentiment, those sorts of things. I think for me, customer engagement is sort of, if customer experience is more of the brain side, customer engagement is more of the heart side. Okay. So where customer experience is more thinking about what happens when a customer purchases our product or engages with our service, how do they feel leaving that interaction? Customer engagement to me is about the relationship. So not just on an individual transaction basis or experience basis, but more, how does the customer feel about our brand and our value as a whole? And are we diversifying the value that we're providing, not just through our primary products or services, but other ways that we're being a trusted advisor or building that relationship? So that's how I sort of think about it.
Great. Related to services transformation strategies, how can an organization effectively identify the services need regarding transformation, the needful change management, how we can change our processes in real in order to increase the efficiency, profitability from the business generated under term services transformation strategy?
So how do you identify what the need for service transformation is?
Yeah.
Right? Okay. So there's a lot of different ways you could look at answering that question. Okay. So a lot of it depends on how the company is perceiving service to the function of its business. And what I mean by this, when I said that early on in my career, I became very intrigued by what was going on. There was a shift that took place then where service traditionally had been perceived as a cost center. It was a necessary evil. It was a means to an end. The entire focus was on keeping costs low, keeping efficiency high. And there was a shift to companies starting to recognize that service can actually be a very strong competitive differentiator. It can be a huge potential profit center for businesses. And so part of how you would answer that question depends on how a company perceives the service function. So if it is one where it's fundamental to their value proposition and it's seen as a potential profit center, then I would say one of the first things you need to understand to answer the question of how you must transform is what it is your customers want and need. Okay. So I always suggest starting outside in instead of inside out. Okay. So I think that would be where I would begin, is really trying to understand, what do our customers think about what we deliver today, but also what aren't we doing that they would find value in, or what are others doing that they find value in, and really sort of assess how much of that competitive advantage you are delivering on. Okay. Then you have to have a good understanding of where you are today. So if there are these different opportunities for you to deliver more value to your customers in a way that would help you make more money, what would it take to do that? Is it different skills, different service delivery model, et cetera, et cetera? And then that's where you figure out sort of where you need to transform. There's also the whole consideration of the internal side. So how efficient are you versus how efficient do you need to be? But I think the best starting place to answer that question is looking at it through the lens of the customer, because if you're harnessing the potential of service as a competitive differentiator, you're able to increase your profit margin, where, not that you don't want to be efficient, but like that shouldn't be the primary focus. I feel like efficiency is the primary focus for an organization who's still sort of perceiving service as a cost center, not a profit center. So I would say starting with really understanding what your customers want, need, and value, and then kind of assessing how much of that you're delivering today, or how much you could potentially deliver.
From your perspective, what are some common challenges in front of organization to increase the services efficiency from internal perspective and from external perspective, in order to engage a lot of stakeholders during end-to-end life cycle?
So I can think of a few big challenges. The first is really that mindset shift. So kind of what we just talked about of how service is perceived. It's an early challenge, but it's one that a lot of companies get hung up on, because particularly when you think about a company that has a long history of delivering products and services, that mindset shift of not thinking about the product or the service or the line item that you're offering, and instead thinking about what brings value to the customer. So the outcome or the peace of mind, and what does that look like? That can be a really big hurdle for companies to get over, that I think is sort of the starting line for the journey. So that mindset shift is one, and that mindset shift has to start at the top, but it trickles down through the organization. So generally speaking, human beings are hardwired to resist change. And so when you start really changing the way that you are approaching customers, what the go-to-market might look like, how you're delivering service, and what tools employees are using, or how they're engaging with customers, it can be a lot of change for people to come on board with. So change management becomes incredibly important. I think the next one is really the technology landscape, because I heard someone say at a conference a few weeks ago, and I liked the way they phrased it. They said, the technology landscape has become more and more sophisticated, but have we? So the technology landscape, there's a ton of capability. The challenge is not in the capability, it's in readying the business to be able to apply that capability. And so that can be a challenge. And also it's evolving so quickly. So there's this pace of change from a technological innovation perspective that companies really have to keep up with. But it's tricky because you also can't race ahead of where the business is. You have to bring the business along. So I think that can be very challenging. And I would say for the vast majority of companies that I talk with, another really big challenge today is talent. So attracting new talent into service at the pace that existing talent is retiring or leaving the workforce, understanding that the historical practice of hiring based on prior experience is really, really not sustainable. We need to think about how we train employees that have potential or aptitude, but not necessarily experience. And that just means doing a lot of things differently within the organization to sort of adapt to just the realities of the talent landscape today. So that's another.
Another point linked to your direction. In a lot of organizations, we are struggling to serve customer SLAs. So from your perspective, how we can accelerate our SLAs from response time perspective, resolve time perspective, and how we can rely on technology, artificial intelligence, machine learning, any cloud application to serve Mr. Customer better, specifically from SLAs scope obligations.
Good question. And this is an area that is really exciting because the technology is there and it's ready to help. Okay. So I think there's a couple of layers to that question. The first is, are we leveraging remote capabilities to assess what's going on? So right out of the gate, if we can understand what the problem is, sometimes we can remotely resolve that problem. Sometimes we can't, but we can significantly increase first-time fix if we just know what we're going to do, right?
Yeah.
So organizations who aren't doing any sort of remote diagnostics, remote service, attempting remote resolution, that's a big shift taking place right now because you have the AI and the machine learning capabilities. So if you have connected devices, you're able to sort of start to predict potential failure points, you're able to monitor for issues, et cetera. And then you have tools like augmented reality that there's a wide range of things where you can have a technician to customer interaction. You can have a technician to technician interaction.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of ways that we can start to use some sort of remote triage or remote assessment as our first line of defense. So right there, you can avoid any unnecessary trips, things that are really simple to fix. Sometimes you even have human error. Customers think there's a problem, but really you need to just tell them, switch this, do this, et cetera. So eliminate any of those unnecessary visits with remote capabilities. Then there's incredibly sophisticated technology on the market right now. IFS has its own AI-powered planning and scheduling optimization tool. So I could tell you stories of a bunch of different companies that are using it that just what you're saying. So the thing that's really interesting is you can set the criteria based on what's most important to you. So for your example, you're asking about meeting customer SLAs, okay?
Yeah.
So you put in those SLA requirements, you put in your talent, you put in your parts, you put in all of the data, and it will automate the process of planning, scheduling, and dispatching so that you are meeting SLAs, you're minimizing travel time, you're minimizing repeat visits. So there's a lot of efficiency and productivity gains that can come from using those technologies. The other thing that's interesting about the planning and scheduling optimization tool is the criteria isn't the same for every company. So you were asking about customer SLAs, but let's say that you're in an industry where response time isn't mission critical, but the customer has really strong sustainability initiatives. You can then set the criteria around least travel time or least emissions, right? So you can pick whatever it is that your primary goals are and then automate your operations based on that. And compared to a lot of the manual processes that companies still have in place for dispatching, it can provide a huge not only cost savings, efficiency gains, faster response, et cetera.
I am totally agree. My criteria to measure the efficiency regarding how we can implement service in real, how we can measure the gap between what we say and what we do. So in order to increase our efficiency and by the end of the day have the readiness to apply all scope obligation based on SLA's obligation and scope of work, we have to measure the gap and work in real how we can decrease this gap in order to be real in front of our customer. Most of us and most of my participants working in a busy organization from process perspective. We have very sophisticated process, a lot of milestone, a lot of buy-in, a lot of approvals, a lot of key stakeholders to obtain the buy-in according to DOA. From your perspective, how we can compromise or at least make a balance between the internal customization and external personalization in front of customers. By the end of the day, Mr. Customer need personalization experience. And at the same time, we have a lot of challenge regarding internal processes, a lot of approval cycles we need to review and validate and back to subject matter expert in order to obtain the approval. How we can implement a balance considering Mr. Customer experience and his personalization perspective or needs?
Great question. So when you think about it, offering a personalized experience to every single customer is not a scalable business practice, right?
Yeah,
so
sure.
That being said, to your point, part of customers' expectations is they want the experience to feel personalized. They don't want to feel like one of thousands or millions. They want to feel unique and important. So I think a big part of this, honestly, is in communication. It's in understanding how the sales process is different in this landscape, like this outcomes-based landscape, versus a more transactional business model of the past. Okay, so what I mean by that is you can really personalize a customer's experience quite a bit just based on speaking in a value narrative instead of in a transactional narrative. That being said, of course, they're going to expect some choice, like some real personalization behind that. And I think most companies have the best success in sort of creating almost templatized personalization. So essentially, you have a core solution, but you have some different offerings on top of that that customers can select from. Okay, so it offers that personalized feel, but in reality, they are choosing from some things that you would already sort of expect them to find important. A lot of this comes down to when you get into the outcomes-based service conversation, it becomes really important to understand your customer personas. So if you're selling into different industries or different environments, different size organizations, once you can sort of understand the commonalities of what's important to them, you can create these options based on things that you know they will find important, but they're choosing from. So then they're feeling a sense of autonomy and personalization, but you're able to plan as an organization for most of what they're going to select.
Another point regarding to internal perspective, any organization has three legs: people, process, and application. So from your perspective, from your point of view, how we can implement smart integration criteria in order to rely on services to reach to a successful balance between people perspective, process perspective, and application perspective?
I think the people part is always the hardest. I think because anytime you're trying to align those three, or you're trying to make changes to the process or to the application, the people part is where the challenges will lie. So I think for me, it sort of comes back to the change management, giving people a voice, listening to feedback, making sure that communication is very strong, and any sort of change or alignment that's taking place, they understand the cause of and also understand how it can benefit them. I think of those three things, people will always be the toughest to stay ahead of.
Sure, there is a common challenges and roadblocks for us during the implementing this transformation, service transformations. So what are the common challenges that we might face and how we can overcome it?
I talked about the mindset shift and the change management. A couple notes on that, just before I talk about another thing, is we need to be conscious of the fact that while most leaders within service businesses understand that we have a shortage of talent, and if anything, we need to become more efficient because we can't bring in talent at the pace we need to, there is still this fear within frontline workers of the technology. I think they still see it as a potential risk to their livelihoods. So even though that fear might seem misplaced to us, we need to be putting them at ease. We need to be celebrating not just achievement, but effort. And we need to be really considering how we're communicating change, et cetera. I would say the other big stumbling block, like if I think about introducing new technology to transform service, is it always seems easier than it's going to be because there inevitably will be processes that need changed, things that need to be addressed. So try and have realistic expectations and try and find a partner who will help you have realistic expectations. And then depending on what you're doing, there's sort of a data readiness consideration, particularly when you think about leveraging AI. It's something that's in every headline everywhere with good reason. But if companies aren't at a point where they have done a good job of building their data infrastructure, it can seem a lot easier to just put in place than it is. So I would say those are some of the challenges to be prepared for.
How important is employee engagement, or let them buy in during the service transformation process to be engaged and to keep them in the comfort zone and keeping them engaged?
I would say it's critical because I mentioned back when I sort of came into this space and I saw that shift from cost center to profit center. Soon after that, companies started really focusing on customer experience. So service organizations, once they recognized that service was a path to differentiation, to revenue, they started really focusing on customer experience and trying to better understand what their customers valued, how they felt about their service experience, et cetera. I think if we're being honest, I think we sort of did that at the detriment of our employee experience and our employee engagement. We focused so much on the customer that we really overlooked the connection of those two things. So in field service specifically, the technician that is going into a customer location to provide service is often the most frequent face-to-face interaction that a customer has with the brand. They really are representing the company and the brand. And so if you have someone going to do that who is unhappy, not engaged, not empowered, you can imagine that they're not going to deliver a great customer experience. So it's very, very important for us to acknowledge the connection between employee engagement and customer satisfaction. And the other thing I would say is it's important to acknowledge that connection. It's important to make it a priority in the business, not just during a transformation, especially during a transformation, but really all of the time. We need to be able to make sure that our employees feel valued, they're adequately recognized for their contribution, they have a good relationship with their line manager, they are able to understand their potential for career advancement, and so on and so on. In a time of transformation, I think one of the most important things is to make them feel a part of it from very early on. So when you sort of identify whatever the need for transformation is, getting together sort of a key stakeholder group, including different functions of the business, different layers of responsibility where everyone feels represented, and having them contribute to the selection of the technology, the refinement of the solution, and then ultimately the deployment of the solution, so that they feel that they're a part of the change versus the change happening to them.
How can an organization make a balance, or what is the balance needed between for agility and flexibility from a side and with the need for stability and reliability during the service transformation?
Yeah, so I think there's definitely a need for both, obviously. If I think about this from a technology standpoint, one of the things that can get very complex is that there's so many tools available today that can provide different capabilities, different benefits. What we have to keep in mind is that I think that reliability, that solid capability, I think comes from having a good core solution that you're using, whatever you use to have everyone have visibility into what's going on within the business, have access to customer history, to knowledge that they might need to conduct their jobs. something that really acts as a source of truth for the organization to run off of. That's really important for that sort of consistency. Everyone sees the same information, everyone can access the same information, it's updated in real time, et cetera. When we start to want to achieve some of these different things we've talked about today, okay, we could use IoT to have access to analytics on our equipment, and then we could apply machine learning and AI to that to predict failures, and then we could use augmented reality so that technicians can talk to one another, et cetera. If we start to bolt too many things on, we start to introduce a lot of potential failure points. So one of the things that's important to balance is benefiting from the sophistication of technology, but also making sure that you aren't creating more complexity than you need, because each point of complexity starts to bring with it a potential for a breakdown in communication or a potential failure. I would say the other thing is true in terms of the flexibility standpoint. So we need to be looking for, and I don't know the technicality of everyone on the call, but 10, 15 years ago, when a company deployed a service management solution, it was done often on premise and typically would then be in place for 10, 15, 20 plus years. With the evolution of the technology and now a lot more cloud-based solutions, that practice is very outdated. And what happens is you end up putting a solution in place that meets the needs of the business at that particular time, but the needs of the business change. So you need to be seeking technology that can allow those business changes without a significant investment, meaning time, money, energy, effort, et cetera, to upgrade all of the time. All right. So there's ways to do that that allow you to have more agility built into the system you're using to manage your operations, so that as the way you need to deliver service evolves or as your customer expectations evolve, you can build that in instead of essentially starting over. So that's kind of the best way, I guess, I can answer that right now. It's both are very, very important, but in a lot of ways, they're less odds with one another than you might think.
When it comes to your past experience with organizations, what do you think are the best practices or steps that an organization can take to begin this service transformation journey?
I would say this: have internal alignment on what the role of and potential for services in the business and what you're aiming to achieve. Have a really good understanding of what's important to your customers. And like we talked about earlier, sort of use that to then assess where you are today versus where you need to be. Assuming that there will be a need for technology, I would say always make sure that you are asking for customer case studies and customer references from any technology provider that you are assessing. Make sure you're looking at things like their longevity in the market, their financial stability. You have a lot of smaller players that will pop up and go away, and that can be a real headache if you invest in a solution that then a few years later is out of support. And then, as I mentioned, involve your workforce early on in the process to make them feel a part of it. And also, it's not just like a change management trick to make them feel a part of it. We also need to respect the fact that our frontline employees that are engaging with customers on a day-to-day basis often have a far better understanding of what the needs actually are than managers that sit layers and layers and layers above. So it's not just sort of an exercise to placate them and to make them feel part of the journey. They really can contribute significantly to helping you achieve the best outcome, but involve them early and all the way through. And then the last thing I would say is, when I was asked earlier about how do we know if we need to be transforming, everyone does. So be prepared to go right into a practice of continual innovation. So there is no finish line anymore. Like, this is something that is ongoing for every business.
Unfortunately, we reached to the end of today's session. So I would like to have final comment from you, Sarah, in order to close the session.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you put me on the spot there. I've said a lot. I think Get excited about the potential, I think, would be my biggest piece of advice. Oftentimes it's because there's so much, or because the pace of change is so fast, it can be overwhelming. But the only difference between a challenge and an opportunity is your perspective. So think about it as an opportunity and be excited about the ability to contribute. If you have other questions, Hany, feel free to give out my email. And I appreciate
For
having
sure.
me.
My pleasure having you, Sarah, and for all participants, don't forget service business is a people business. So we have to do believe the future is still very human.